You're listening to Why We Do What We Do. Welcome to Why We Do What We Do. I am your journalist host, Abraham.
And I'm your, I guess maybe compassionate host, Shane, hopefully?
Yeah, you are. Absolutely.
Yeah, I try.
We're a psychology podcast. We talk about all kinds of psychology things, and every once in a while, we'll ask someone to join us and bring their expertise and lend to us their wisdom that we may share it with you, our dear audience. And we're doing that today.
You know, we are not primarily an interview podcast.
Right.
We try not to do that because there are some people that do it well and do it better than we do.
Yeah.
But it's always a lot of fun to bring in insights and unique voices because, you know, we are but two people with a limited knowledge of the phenomenon that occur in this universe. And so it is always really great to bring in those different perspectives, especially people who are just like a lot of fun to talk to.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is our guest. Her name is Saundra Bishop. Absolutely a professional of the highest order. A wonderful guest, wonderful to have her. Really enjoyed this discussion we got to have with her. Before we transition, of course, if you're new to the show, thank you for joining us. As I said, we talk all things psychology, comedy, science, that sort of thing. And if you'd like to support us, you can always subscribe wherever you're listening to podcasts, tell a friend. You can join us on Patreon where you get special bonuses and that sort of thing. Buy some merch from our merch store. And I'll talk a little bit more about that after this interview. But I think without a whole lot of further ado, I'm really excited to share with you this discussion we had with Saundra about trauma-informed behavior management. Anything else before we segue into this interview?
No, let's do it. I think you all will enjoy this one.
All right. See you on the other side. Thank you so much for joining me. Saundra Bishop, welcome to Why We Do What We Do.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Perfect. I'm really excited for us to have this conversation. You sort of reached out describing what you were up to, and we get a lot of people who reach out to us who we don't follow up with. And I don't think they've ever heard the podcast. I think they just stumble across a podcast and then email us saying, hey, we want to promote our stuff. But you immediately jumped out as someone who had something really interesting and useful to say and knowledgeable. And so I would like to just start by asking who you are and what do you do?
So my name is Saundra Bishop. I am the clinical director and CEO of Basics ABA Therapy, which is a DC-based company that does in-home therapy. We mostly work with kids with autism. And we're doing something really exciting in the field. Our field is at a transition point.
Okay. Yeah.
Where there's a lot of controversy right now because the field does a lot of things that aren't great. One of those things is we're not trauma-informed.
Fair.
So I've been doing a lot of work over the last 5 or 6 years on developing a trauma-informed way of doing ABA, behavioral therapy, working with kids, teaching skills. And, I've been in the field for 20 years and we've developed this model and it's really exciting. And I've been trying to get it out there.
Wow. That's fantastic. And so I'm always curious. I mean, first of all, really quick, I assume then your training is in behavior analysis and you're a BCBA and came up through that field.
Correct. Yeah. So I've been a BCBA for 13 years.
Okay.
Which is actually something that's super interesting, at least to me, is that APBA, which is one of our professional organizations, did like a state of ABA a few years ago and said that 2/3 of BCBAs had been certified in the last 3 years.
Wow. That's some explosive growth.
Right. And so there's all these BCBAs there are some BCBAs who've been in the field for like 30 years. Right. And then there's all these new BCBAs. And then there's this like group of BCBAs like me who've been here for like 13 years, who were trained by all these older BCBAs and who are now training all these new BCBAs. And we're the ones who are having this crisis of realizing we don't want to do things the same way.
Yeah.
And so it's this cool opportunity to really affect change.
Yeah, for sure.
And I want to take that opportunity.
Absolutely. So how did you come to be so involved in this form of trauma-informed movement, if you don't mind sharing, only as much as you're comfortable with?
Yeah, I became a foster parent.
Okay.
Yeah, I opened my company when I had a baby. And, I started the company with a baby on my back. And 3 years later, I became a foster parent. I've adopted 3 kids from foster care.
Wow.
And I started taking classes on trauma-informed behavior management. Right. Okay. And in those models, they tell you, right, and of course, this is like really breaking it down to the like baby basics. But a kid throws a shoe at you, and you hug them and you tell them you love them, right? And it's the old adage, right, that they're going to leave you before you leave them, right? All of that stuff. And it works. But in ABA, right, behavior management, a kid throws a shoe at you and you turn your back and you ignore them until they follow your direction, right? And like that works too, right? You don't want a kid to throw a shoe at you to get your attention because that's not functional. But you can't do both and you can't do neither, right? We can't keep telling foster parents that they need to get shoes thrown at them.
Sure.
And we can't ignore a kid who's been neglected, experienced neglect.
Right.
So they'll clean their room.
Yeah.
And so I realized that there was this gap. And so I sort of developed this theory and this model, which there are other people who kind of did it also at the same time. Dr. Hanley's working on a model, Dr. Kolu, they'll do some great work where we look at that trauma events as, we call it a setting event. It's something that makes it more or less likely when you ask a kid to do something, they'll engage in a behavior, that we can truly honor those trauma events while we're supporting kids in learning skills.
Wow. That's so inspiring to hear. And as you said, it seems like the field of behavior analysis just didn't really have a way of talking about trauma and how that related to subsequently how we might provide support for individuals. And although this seems particularly relevant for foster care and adoption, I think this certainly qualifies for individuals with intellectual diagnoses of some kind, developmental diagnoses as well. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. And I mean, ABA is not just for autism. It just right now it's funded by insurance for autism.
Right. So
those are the students that get the services. But yeah, I mean, ABA can apply to anybody. But I think what happened is, I've been doing this for 7 years.
Yeah.
Is COVID happened.
Okay.
And every single kid, every single adult, every single therapist on March 20th or thereabouts experienced a trauma event, right? All our kids lost access to their teachers. They all had to go home and no longer had access to their favorite places, right? Their grandparents died, right? They couldn't go and get their favorite snacks at the store because the supply chains broke down, right? And all of a sudden, behavior analysts that didn't believe in trauma events saw them happen. And nobody could deny, well, some people are still denying, but a lot of providers couldn't deny and saw firsthand the trauma event happened and its direct effect on behavior.
Got it.
And then also because everything went remote, I could do these webinars.
Fair. Yeah.
And I had access to these communities and these podcasts and things like that. And conferences went remote. There was one week I presented as a keynote speaker in Tennessee. Oh, maybe it wasn't Tennessee. Oh, Tennessee, I'm sorry if I wasn't at your conference. But I presented as a keynote speaker at one conference. I presented in Florida at another conference. And I presented at a third conference in Oregon, all in the same week.
Wow.
Which I couldn't have done if it were in person.
Yeah, you'd be flying all over the place.
Yeah. And so all of that happened all at once. And I think it really helped light a fire under the field to start really thinking about this.
Now, as you mentioned, sort of describing what that trauma was, and you give a couple examples of things like not having access to your favorite stuff, and just to make sure it's clear for listeners, like just because you don't have your favorite thing, that wouldn't necessarily constitute a trauma event, but it was the total cutoff of access to like a world that you're used to having access to. Is that correct? Yes,
absolutely. Also, the thing about trauma events too is that the effect, just because something bad happens to you, doesn't mean you'll experience it as a trauma event. 3 people could be in the same car crash and only one person could experience it as a trauma event. Somebody losing a stuffy, right, is unlikely that will be a trauma event.
Right.
But for somebody, it could be, right?
Right. Sure.
And so in these circumstances, particularly our kids who are particularly attached to items, losing them in COVID could be. But yeah, when I make that list, it's a 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 all happened to them at the same time, which contributed to a totality of likelihood. So yeah, that's a great point.
All right, perfect. So let's start getting into a little bit more of the nuances here, because I'm certainly curious. I'm imagining that our listeners are too. Of just, so how would you define this trauma-informed behavior management approach?
Yeah. And so, obviously there's different ways that I explain it to clinicians and parents and providers. And so there's like threading that needle in this conversation here.
Got it. Yeah.
Basically, right. So trauma event is something that because we're behavior analysts, right? And so just a quick, 1 second summary of what a behavior analyst is. Mm-hmm. A behavior analyst, right? We're a master's level clinician. And we do typically called ABA, which is applied behavior analysis. And what our field is known for is we target behaviors that are observable and measurable, right? Mm-hmm. You jump up and down and scream. That is an observable behavior, right? I'm not going to say you're sad, you're mad. I'm not going to say you miss your grandmother and let's talk about your grandmother. I see you jump up and down and scream. That's observable. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to look at what happens before that behavior. I asked you to clean your room, and I'm going to look at what happened afterwards. You jumped up and down and screamed, and you got sent to timeout, right? And I'm going to look at that chain, and then the function, right, over time, well, what did you get out of that? We got sent to timeout, right? Oh, you got out of cleaning your room.
Right.
Right? So the function is escape, right? And so then behavior analysts historically are going to create a behavior plan that says every time you jump up and down and scream, I'm going to stand there and mom has to point at you until you clean your room. And it doesn't matter what you do. You could start kicking holes in walls. We're going to call that an extinction burst. It doesn't matter. And eventually I'm the boss of you and you're going to clean your room. Well, that sucks. And it's not nice. And it works, but it's not nice. Right. Mm-hmm. And so that's the kind of ABA we're trying to get away from.
Right.
And the problem with that, though, is that when people who are criticizing ABA, particularly autistic adults, and they say that's ABA, providers go, oh, no, that's old ABA. But there is no old ABA. That's what people are still doing.
Yeah.
And so that's the foundation of it. And so when we bring the trauma piece involved, what you do then is you look at what interventions can happen as a part before all that happens. Mm-hmm. Now, good ABA, even old ABA, is going to do this too.
Sure. Yeah.
They just get stuck in that end part.
Yeah.
And so you're going to look at antecedent interventions, right? If a kid sees a cookie and he jumps up and down and screams, well, you know what? Put the cookies away.
Right.
Right. Let's not make a 4-year-old look at cookies. If he doesn't need the cookies, he's not going to jump up and down. And yes, you can't hide all the cookies in the universe, but you can hide them from your kitchen. You don't need to have them out, right? And then a setting event is something that happens right before that's more likely to make the antecedent, the thing before the behavior, cause you to engage in behavior, right? If he didn't have breakfast, when he sees a cookie, he's more likely to jump up and down and scream. Make sure he eats breakfast, right? Mm-hmm. Super simple stuff that we know is part of our science, but we forget sometimes.
Sure.
And so the last thing, because this isn't a 3-hour lecture, I promise, is that the trauma piece is that you look at trauma as an additional setting event, as an additional, oh, he forgot to eat. Oh, he didn't take his medicine. Any of these things. But if you target those, right? If you have a toddler who's tantruming because he's tired and you ask him to put his shoes on, you don't need to do an intervention around shoe tying. He doesn't care about putting his shoes on. Just give the kid a nap, right? And so with trauma, if our friend who's tantruming about cookies has experienced early food deprivation, well, you know what? No matter how much time I try to tolerate him looking at cookies and not eating them, it doesn't matter. If I rip the cookies away and hide them, I'm going to reinforce the narrative that he's not going to get fed. Mm-hmm. So under this model, we notice that and we put into effect an intervention that's going to deal with that anxiety. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to give him a food chart and I'm going to tell him when our meals are in our house. I'm going to give him access to food that's, more healthy foods that he's going to like. We're going to have fruits and vegetables all day long that he can eat whenever he wants. And then we're going to say when cookies are during the day. And we're going to address that, because if we can address that concern, then all the rest of the behaviors may never happen.
Yeah.
So that's the crux of it.
Okay. I love that. It seems like it's just, and something we talk about so much on this podcast is how important context is. And the fact that when we're looking at when any one behavior occurs, it not only occurs in that moment, but it also has been sort of it's always this part of an evolving, ongoing interaction that the individual has with their circumstances. So often we can't see what those circumstances have been, or we don't know. It's not always as black and white as this type of reaction will work to change their behavior. as much as how is that ultimately in the best interest of supporting them. Does that sound correct?
Yeah, definitely. And that's where we get into our consequence interventions in this model. Is it's not about, I'm going to point to you until you clean your room.
Yeah.
Because whatever. I mean, a kid can't punch you in the face and not clean their room, right? That still can't happen because they can't punch you in the face. But we have an acronym that's called BASICS, which is very clever because my company's name is BASICS. So I'm adorable.
Branding.
Yes. But it's like break, it's always reinforce, it's safety, I wonder statements, calmness, and silliness. And they're responses that you can do to behaviors that are outside this function, right? And they're all about de-escalation.
Okay.
If a kid is in crisis, they're not going to be able to respond.
Yeah.
So if I've asked you to clean your room and you're throwing yourself on the ground, sure, I can win. I'm 40 years old and you're 5. I can last out any tangent. I got snacks downstairs. I got water. Eventually you're going to have to pee. I can beat you, but what's the point of that, right? So instead, like, let me de-escalate this, right? I'm going to sit and I'm going to be like, I wonder if you're feeling worried right now, right? I'm going to sit there and say like, hey, remember, we can do our butterflies to calm down. Hey, do you need a hug right now? Even if that behavior is to get my attention, if they are in crisis and so dysregulated, they need attention to calm down. And then we can deal with the other thing later. If I was talking on the phone, then I can be like, yo, listen, you can't interrupt me on my phone call. I need to go back on my phone call.
Yeah.
And you can go talk to another adult or you can wait. But like, while you're in this like crisis, I need to support you because you're a small child.
Right. Yeah. So why do you think it's so important that we really start involving this in more of what we do, what behavior analysts do, and probably, I think, just people who are going to be around a lot of other little people in general? Why is this such an important topic for them?
I think that behavior analysts get stuck in, I have to follow the process and procedure, and I don't know what anxiety is, and I don't know these things because that isn't part of our training. And by us talking about this, I'm able to operationally define it. And I can say like, okay, yes, we don't know what anxiety is, but I could tell you those words, right? Your heart's beating, you're sweating, right? We can define those things, but that we don't need to use those terms. But that if we're not identifying these setting events and these chains, we're re-traumatizing kids. Like that's the fact of it. And again, I can define that word if you want me to. And I always tell people in trainings, like, but don't make me, it's annoying. Like, I'll do it if you want me to when this is over, but like you're being pedantic and it's annoying to do that. But that if you are taking a kid who's been parentified, right, who's been responsible for caring for their siblings, and you do a follow through with making them clean their room, you may be reinforcing the messaging that they are going to be responsible for caring for the household. When literally, if you just made a chart that said, these are grown-up jobs and kid jobs, you may prevent the entire behavior chains from happening in the first place. And you're not even going to have to get to the point of the follow-throughs. And you're going to give the space to be able to do the teaching and to teach the replacement. Because if you're not, you're going to get stuck in these extinctions and the extinction bursts and reinforcing the image, the messaging, right? These trauma event learning histories. And then we're not going to have any opportunity for skill teaching.
Right.
And so if we want to look at it just from behavior analytic lessons, words, right? There's no opportunity for skill teaching. Right. But from like a human standpoint, it's mean. Right. And that's what I say in my trainings. I'm like, I use these words too. Like it's mean.
Yeah.
It is mean to a tiny human.
Yeah.
To make them cry until they throw up.
Right. Also something that I think that none of us would, were we in that position, feel like that's how we would want that interaction to go. Even knowing, like, I think sometimes we understand there are things that will be effective at shaping our own behaviors that maybe we even understand would be better if they were shaped to be different than they were. But we also are like, but maybe not that way, you know? I think we can probably think of a boss or supervisor or something who's just like, they'll do something that like is so annoying and it works, and you know that it works, and you know why they do it, but it's just like, could you maybe have a better way of approaching this? Because this sucks for an employee.
Yeah. And this model too is really about teaching those skills on the forefront and giving the students, it's reducing that anxiety. Again, I'm quoting the words anxiety because it's not behavior analytic, but we can define it and all of these things. But that you reduce that dysregulation on the beginning so you can teach them the skills to access their needs. So they're not even have to engage in the problem or the ineffective behaviors so that you're not having to deal with that side of it. So you let them say no, you let them refuse touch, you let them do all of those things so they're not hitting you so that you don't have to worry about if you have to do a follow through or not.
Right.
And that like makes people really squishy because it's like, well, I asked them to do their room and they said no. Like, okay, well, don't make them clean their room. And then they're like, but they have to clean their room. I'm like, okay, but are they cleaning their room when they throw the shoe at you? And they're like, no. It's like, okay, well, they're already not cleaning your room. So let's let them clean room. Stop cleaning their room for saying no, which is not harming anyone, instead of making them throw a shoe at you, which probably doesn't make them feel good either.
Yeah.
And it's not just behavior analysts that struggle with this, right? It's teachers, it's parents, it's really everybody. And it's about the thing that's neat about what I'm doing is that I have a handbook, and the handbook has like an actual chart. And so you can lay out the plan and so you can see where it's going.
Okay.
And I think that that's helpful for people to see.
Yeah.
And we have there's a free download of one of them on the website. So you can kind of see what part of it looks like. The consequence piece of it.
Yeah.
Is on the website. That's like a free download that people can look at.
Yeah.
But I think that's helpful.
I'll put in the links on this.
Yeah. So I think that's helpful for people to see.
Very much so. Yeah.
But it's hard. It's hard to like ask a kid to do something and let them say no. I have 4 kids. My kids can be jerks sometimes. I yell at my kids sometimes more than I probably should admit to while I talk about training parents. But that's the other piece, right? There's the goal. Yeah. And there's real life.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you can't always be perfect, and that's okay.
Right.
As long as you understand where you're trying to go.
Yeah. I think that's actually a really important distinction is for those people who hear this and think, I don't think I could keep that up. And I think it's always real important to point out realistically, like you're a human too. And like at some point you may just not have the patience to deal with a situation. And like, that's okay. As you said, if you're sort of like the 5-to-1, if you're leaning more this compassionate angle as opposed to reactive, punitive angle, I think you're ultimately going to be in the net positive, the net gain, and moving toward, I guess, maybe moving away from maintaining the trauma and what might be there for that individual.
Yeah, 100%. And, as behavior analysts, we're told if we don't do it perfectly, it's not going to work. And then we tell parents that. And the fact is it's just like not true. Like in a perfect world, yes, you would do it 100% correctly. And we're like, it's like, variable reinforcement. It's like the slot machine. And it's like, yeah, but kids aren't like dumb, right? They don't like live there in a vacuum. They can also like, my kid knows when I'm the right amount of distracted to ask me a question. She's not just like guessing that I might say yes or no. She like knows when to ask me that I'm going to say yes to something that she knows full well I would say no to otherwise. So like, it's not really this like, so we got to give kids credit for more. And also there's apologies, right? Yeah. We can apologize when we make mistakes. It's not all just a vacuum.
Yeah. And it's so important to model that kind of thing for kids as well, to see like, hey, adults, we make mistakes. We know how to, this is what we do when we make mistakes, that we fix it. We come back to it. We correct, what the people that we've hurt, we make that better as much as possible, sort of thing. Because otherwise just look like, well, if you're adult, you don't have to apologize for anything.
Right.
And that's not a good message either.
Yeah. The other thing that like I love is visuals. And so most for anything, but especially these like trauma event interventions. And so a visual, like I talked about for kids who've had like parentification or have been responsible for tasks, is like grown-up jobs and kid jobs, right? It's your kid job to clean your room. It's non-negotiable. It's what you have to do. You will not get your allowance. You will be grounded in your room. if you don't do this job, right? That may be your family expectations. But these are my grown-up jobs. I'm going to feed you. I'm going to take you to school. I'm going to vacuum. I'm going to do the dishes. Like, these are my jobs. I'll show you this chart anytime you're anxious about it. These are my jobs, and this is your job. The thing with those, though, is you actually have to put things, like, you have to do the things that are on the list. So if you know that, like, you're not somebody that vacuums, like, don't put vacuuming on there. Like, so just be sure with that. But people will often get caught up in needing to, like, make it in the PowerPoint with the clip arts and all of that stuff. But, like, you can just, like, write them down on a piece of paper. I'm trying to see if I have one in here. I don't think I do. But, like, they just scribble it down. No, the kids don't care what they look like. They can literally just be drawn as a matrix with a marker in front of the kid. Another really good one is, like, family rules, you know, for kids who've experienced, like, a physical abuse. A good way to word it is, like, in this house, grown-ups don't hit if there are other kids, because sometimes other kids will hit and you can't control that. Like, especially if you have young kids. And so you don't want to have a rule that says we don't hit, because that's not true.
Right.
So you could say, like, grownups don't hit, and, like, kids, like, should try not to hit or something like that. Right.
Yeah.
Because if you say we don't hit and then other kids hit them, well, now they don't know. Now the rule has been broken. And so now they don't know if grownups don't hit. And so, so I love visuals, and also just write them in chicken scratch on a piece of paper, because, and just get them up. And just get them made.
Sounds like just stating expectations is a big part of this. Making sure, like, what is expected is really clear. So I wonder if you have an example, I think it might be useful to just talk through a real or hypothetical example of how you might bring this approach to supporting an individual who has trauma, and something where either, again, if this is a real example you have and you've intervened, or just a hypothetical one you use when you train on this model. How do you go about solving that issue? Just, I think, really help paint the sort of the scene and the picture for people who are interested.
So I gave a little bit of example of the kid with the cookie. So I think I could sort of go back to that one probably to talk through the chain.
Okay.
So it's a little bit hard. I have this, like, whole chart. So I'll see if we can follow this through, and you can interrupt me if it doesn't feel clear. But I think what you're asking for is, like, the step-by-step, what would be his, like, little intervention, basically?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, pretty much.
So Marcos is our friend with the cookie that we talked about a little bit before. Okay. So the summary of Marcos. So Marcos is a fake kid. I use him for training. So Marcos loves cookies. We know that he's 8 years old. He has autism, and he can use two words. He can say cookie, and he can say pee-pee. That's what we happen to know. So those are the things we know about him to start off with. So when he sees a cookie, he jumps up and down and screams, and his mom gives him a cookie. Okay. He is more likely to do this when he skipped breakfast. So that's the first thing we know. So we would do our antecedent intervention, which is what happens before the behavior, is we would make sure we put away the cookies. If there's no cookies, he can't jump and down and scream.
Okay.
For a replacement behavior, to get his need met, we would teach him to make sure he can say the word cookie already, because we don't want to teach him to use a skill he doesn't know how. But we would work on making sure he says cookie when he sees cookies. So instead of jumping up and down and scream, we would be like, hey, dude, just say cookie. We'll give you cookies. Yeah. Cool. Right. Yeah. And then for the traditional consequence intervention in, like, real life, if he jumped up and down and screamed, he wouldn't get a cookie. But we're going to put that one in a box right now, because we're not going to do that. Right. Yeah. So then we're also going to make sure he gets fed breakfast, because we know if he doesn't get breakfast, he's more likely to do all this. Right. So that's what we know. Perfect. So now the intervention's not working. So we talk to mom some more. We're like, dude, what else do we know? She's like, oh yeah, I forgot. He also was in foster care before he came to live here, and he didn't get fed for weeks at a time. And we're like, oh my gosh. So he had early food deprivation. So now, right, we talked about this. We're going to do a setting event and scene intervention. We call it TESI intervention. And we're going to give him a meal chart, right? And this is not a restrictive meal chart. So this is not a diet. This isn't an anything, but this is just a, like, hey, so snack time's always at 10 and 3. Breakfast is at this time, and lunch is at this time, and dinner's at this time. We're always going to get food this time of day, right? You need to be careful. Some kids will get really rigid at a time. I have one kid who, like, if we tell her it's at noon and it's 12:05, she's going to fall out, even 5 years after being here. So we have to be like between 12 and 1.
Yeah.
So you have to be careful about that. And then free access to a food they like, but that's going to be somewhat on the healthy side, which can be difficult because some kids are restrictive. So he likes carrots. So we're going to put carrots on the table, and we're going to make his little meal chart, right? So he has a meal chart. We're feeding him breakfast. We're hiding the cookies, and we're asking him to say the word cookie.
And he's got unrestricted access to one snack.
Yep. And so all of those things have hopefully prevented the behavior. Also now, which is what makes us super cool with this model, is we're going to teach him to access those things we just provided for him. I'm going to teach him to make sure he gets breakfast. As an adult, I need to make sure he gets breakfast. But also, I'm going to teach him how to make cereal on the off chance that he's hungry and he wants some cereal. Or I'm going to teach him, maybe he's 16, right? And he needs to, we happen to know he's 8, but he needs to, ask before, we're going to teach him to ask for school breakfast some days, right? So we're going to teach him to access that setting event intervention. I'm also going to teach him to go and look at that chart we made him. I'm going to teach him to walk over to that food we gave him. And that's the thing that ABA does that's really cool that we miss in the traditional therapeutic side is there's a discrete teaching component of it. We don't just say, like, here's the stuff on the table. I'm actually going to sit with him and I'll be like, hey, let's practice. I'm feeling hungry. Let's walk over to the table. And like, it feels silly, but like, particularly with a kid who doesn't talk. Yeah. Here's where your food is. You can have this all the time. Right. Yeah. And then, so those are 3 replacement behaviors we've taught him now. To go get his food we've given him free access to go look at his chart so he feels less worried, and to ask the word cookie. And that's what the response is. Well, you can't have cookies all the time. Yeah, okay, right. That's why we're doing these other things. And then now, if all those things don't work, right, we messed up our intervention, he just really wants cookies that day, everything's terrible, then we do our consequence intervention, right? We can't give him the cookie because he's like hitting us. But now we're going to do those de-escalation things, right? We're going to be silly. I'm going to grab the carrots and I'm going to like pretend like I'm Cookie Monster eating the carrots to try to de-escalate and move on. If that's going to work for him. If I did that to my 9-year-old, she would like scream louder. She'd be so mad at me. Right. I'm going to calmly redirect him to his tools that he has. I'm going to make sure there's nothing in the space that he could hit his head on when he throws his head down, when he falls down because he's having a fit, right? I'm going to do these things. I'm going to give him a hug, right? I'm going to do these things to redirect, to help de-escalate him. And then if in the middle of it, he says cookie, I'm going to be like, great, you said cookie, awesome job. Let's go get your cookie. Whereas again, a lot of the traditional interventions are going to say, nope, they have to be totally calm. They have to start over, or they've started the tantrum. Even if they say cookie, they can't have it because you don't want to chain the two together. We don't do that because we want to honor the fact that they were dysregulated and they came back out of it.
Absolutely.
That's how this plays out for Marcos.
Got it. That was very helpful. One of the things you said there at the end, I've increasingly become a fan of avoiding all or nothing sort of rules. And it's like, if maybe there's a little stumble, we don't get like the biggest of the big, but we shouldn't lose all of our progress that we made up to that point. Feels better to me and usually to the kid as well. If it's sort of like, you're going to keep earning. My rule is I don't take things away. That's the rule I have is for me, that sort of the adults don't hit is like, Abraham doesn't take things away. So I can give, but I just keep giving in small increments so that like whatever's earned is earned. And then like the closer we get to the big thing, then cool. Like, we'll ultimately get there. But if we don't, then it's not all for nothing either. It does sound like, just to summarize really quick of what you were talking about, the really important components seem to be that you identify the antecedents that are going to be relevant, particularly for whatever trauma they may have experienced, and put a new way of ensuring that at the very least, there is some informative component for this individual, that they can reference a chart, as you said, or a list or something, so that whatever concerns there may have been, there's a way for them to, I think, feel safe about that situation. And then some of the other ones are, again, just addressing like what kind of sort of, if you will, non-contingent thing can we have be available? Mm-hmm. And then another really important part that you mentioned that I really liked as well is actually teach and practice those replacement behaviors that are going to allow them to be successful in navigating that situation, which a word that I think parents like to hear a lot is that also gives them independence. Mm-hmm. You know, if they've got some of those replacement behaviors, then you don't need to be on top of managing that the entire time. They can do a little bit of that navigating themselves. And I think that makes life easier for everybody, you know?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think something I always like to bring in is, where do you see that people make the most common sort of mistakes? Like, what are easy pitfalls where people they think they're on the right track, but there's something they're missing?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's two places that always comes up in the trainings is that people think they're doing a setting event intervention when they're actually teaching a replacement behavior, which is not the correct place to do it. So one of the examples I have is Hawa is asked to clean her room and she runs away, right? That's the example. And I'm like, okay, so what would be an antecedent intervention, right? And the answer is, don't ask her to clean her room, or it could be ask her to pick up one thing, or kind of the two low-hanging fruit ones.
Yeah.
And always I get, offer her free time after she cleans her room, or, teach her how to fold clothes. And those are interventions. Mm-hmm. And so people think that like, oh, well, if I give her a reward, that's going to make her more likely to do it. And therefore it's an antecedent intervention. And it's not. Mm. That's not going to effectively fix things. So I think really understanding that antecedents stop the behavior from being possible to happen.
Right.
Right. If asking her to clean her whole room is the problem, but picking up one sock is no big deal, then that's what we start with.
Got it.
So that's one area. And then the other area is teaching what we call alternative behaviors, which are important. And I didn't talk about that before because I think they're like so last on the list, which is kind of what you like want them to do instead of a replacement behavior. And so with Marcos, you want him to just leave the cookies alone and stare at them, right? Mm-hmm. That would be the like alternative behavior, right? Yeah. But I find that like, I don't target those usually because I find having the replacement behaviors and all of this stuff usually addresses that. I mean, ultimately I'll target it, but it's not like the primary thing because he's not going to be able to stare at and tolerate the cookies if he's still getting like super dysregulated and can't even ask for them yet. So that'll be like a future goal. But the alternative behavior is the replacement behavior. So what's Marcos is our replacement behavior? Okay, we're going to work on him staring at the cookies for 1 minute without a tantrum. No, that's not a replacement behavior. And so replacement behaviors are always getting the kid's need met.
Right.
So Hawa's running out of the room. What's her replacement behavior? It's always, she says no. Mm-hmm. And we honor the no. Always, always, always. The kid who he's throwing his pencil because he doesn't want to do math. What's the replacement behavior? It is not that he does one math worksheet. The replacement behavior is he says no, thank you.
Okay.
So those are the two things. And if you're messing those up, you're never going to get beyond. You're not going to move forward. You may successfully have an intervention because you're going to reinforce on-task behavior, but that is not following this process.
Got it. And so just to summarize, it sounds like the first step here was kind of just shaping. You're making small steps toward whatever the ultimate way you like to have them show up in that context, or some of it. Obviously, antecedents could involve things like with the example of the cookies, just putting them out of sight and maybe not even purchasing or making them in the first place. It might be another step there. Mm-hmm. But with the example of cleaning up the room, that it's sort of like, what is a reasonable expectation that will work? Mm-hmm. And then you'll probably build on that over time. And the second part, just because I think alternative behavior is not necessarily a technical term here. This is sort of a useful distinction you've found, right? Mm-hmm. Okay. And so it sort of sounds like with the replacement behavior, as you said, it's getting a need met, whereas the alternative behavior is tolerating the unpleasant situation is kind of what it sounds like. And while that might be useful, that's probably not where you want to start. And ultimately, I think with a good intervention, you probably won't need to. Like, you'll probably get tolerating those unpleasant circumstances as a byproduct of having that situation feel more workable to both people.
Yeah, typically. And I did want to say something more about one more thing about the setting event, the trauma setting event intervention, is that I did make it sound like it was always like a visual or something like that. But it also can just be something that the adult is aware of. Like if somebody had experienced physical abuse, that you don't touch them. Right. That can also just be something that's an intervention there that you're using.
Yeah.
You know, things like that. Like we have a student who we actually have permission to generally talk about his case, who also had parentification, and that has resulted in refusing to do daily living tasks now. And so we are so one of our interventions is we only do one daily task at a time. And that's part of our TESI, our setting event trauma intervention, because we know that that's trigger. If we did 5 tasks, even though he needs to do all 5 tasks, he'll shut down and not do anything.
Got it.
So,
yeah, it makes sense. Just sort of following up on that, because my partner and I were also looking into fostering and adopting and went through some of the classes. And one of the examples they used was describing an individual who had, at like the dinner table, it was like dinner, one of their beloved grandparents or something had, in the middle of dinner, like a serious medical issue, and ended up like collapsing and having to be ambulanced out of there and ultimately passing away. And so the dinner table became like a place that they just did not want to be. And so they were like, they would eat in their room, they'd eat in the living room, not going to eat at the dinner table. And so they're sort of like, we're not just going to make them eat at the dinner table. And I was like, that's reasonable. You know, like, let's just make mealtime feel safe. And ultimately, like, you'll probably be able to get back to the dinner table at some point, but that's not the battle that's worth fighting right now for them.
Well, and I think that that's a perfect example though, too, because maybe nobody knows that.
Yeah.
Right. Nobody knew that. Maybe nobody knew that history. Maybe the kid is not talking yet or communicating vocally. And that's a lot of questions I get. Well, what if we don't know the history? And that's where you want to look at it as, somebody coined the term trauma universal precautions. Right.
I like that.
So this kid won't sit at the table. Okay. We don't know why. So do we default to an extinction procedure where we force this kid to sit at the table until we break his will?
Right.
Because why won't he sit? It's socially appropriate to sit at a table.
Yeah.
How's he going to sit at the lunchroom and at a restaurant unless I make him sit at this table and cry and throw up and flip his food over until he does it because I'm going to make him? Or do I use my universal trauma precautions and teach him to say no, work on the other spaces, figure out if I can, come up with other ways to have meals, which already we have, right? Meals are a social experience. So can we have the social experience? Like, what is it we're trying to get out of a dinner that we can get somewhere else? Can he go? If we're saying, well, he has to do it at school and restaurants and all those things, well, can he? Like, let's double check. Is this transferring to those other spaces? Or are we just deciding because he can't do it here, he can't do it there? Does he hate the social aspect of it? If he hates the social aspect of it, well, why? And does that really matter? And so it's about like really breaking that down. And in theory, right, if I were to say that at a conference to just like a bunch of people who do traditional ABA, they'd be like, of course we do that. Of course we wouldn't we would look at all of those things. And it's not true. It's absolutely not true. We think we do that.
Yeah.
In theory, our science does all that, which is why trauma-informed ABA that I talk about is our science. But it's not. It's not what's done in practice. We look at the traditional ABA is going to look at the ABCs and say, they ask him to come to the table and he doesn't. And he flips the table and he gets to go outside. So it's escape. Yeah. So I really like that. I think that's a great example. And as you can see, I got very excited.
No, that was great. That was fantastic. Yeah, I think just sort of as you're saying, it seems like such an important thing here that would be, and I love that phrase. What was it? The universal trauma informed?
Universal trauma precautions. I did not make
precautions. Okay. Either way, I think it's fantastic and such an awesome idea.
Mm-hmm.
I like the idea of also just what I think is afforded in that is always considering where is the individual currently at, and like, let's meet them there. And then we'll, we have what might be an important goal, and also maybe consider the fact that we might not have an important goal, and we'll figure that out too. But is like right now, they're not doing the thing that we're expecting them to do. What are they doing? Like, where are we starting? And like, let's make that our starting place rather than we're going to go from 0 to 60 in seconds. So, and
again, really refocusing on like, why do we want them to do it? Right? Like one of the things we always look at, and it's actually written in our behavior plan that parents have to sign, and we have the clients sign them when it's possible, is that all of the goals in the behavior plan is and our programs have to be socially valid to the client with the goal of independence. And so if a client is like, I don't want to sit at a table because I hate y'all and you smell, then if they hate people and think they smell at tables, then why are we going to waste a bunch of time having them sit at tables with people if their goal as adults is never to sit at a table because they think people smell at tables? Like, people don't have to sit at tables to live happy lives. Now, it is an important skill, and we should consider, well, okay, are there ways to make it smell better for you? Can we put an essential oil on the bottom of your nose? Would that make things better? So you could, could you have dinner with people you don't hate? So there are ways to like explore it. But even if there's not a trauma history, if they can't eat dinner at the family table, why? Is the chair uncomfortable? Is the refrigerator too loud? Are the lights blinking? Are the forks clacking on the table? Are they allergic to wheat? And mom's favorite food is pasta because that's all I cook is pasta when I cook because I don't cook dinner. Right? Like, they're always like, Mom made food. That's not a service I provide. And so those are the things too, like, even if we're not talking about trauma.
Got it.
And I haven't done anything if I just make him sit there. I've just taught him to be uncomfortable.
So I'm curious, what are the most common sort of but or pushback that you'll get, or maybe major questions that you'll get from either other professionals or parents when you're doing this work or these workshops?
So I don't get a lot, actually.
Oh, okay.
So the last presentation I did, I got the survey responses, or it was one of the last. And so I had 150 people attend.
Wow.
Okay, actually, it was 158 people. And 150 of them rated me a 4 or a 5. Right? It was out of 5. 8 people gave me a 1.
Okay. Wow. That was it? Just 1 or 4 or 5?
Yeah.
Okay.
One of the people told me I was very rude. But for the most part, people come because they have to pay to come see me talk. Yeah. So they're not like paying to come see me if they like, because I get picked to do a lot of the like post-conference workshops. And so for the most part, people are just like so excited because there's a lot of BCBAs who are wanting to leave the field because of this crisis of feeling like, ABA is not listening to the need to change. And so people come, I get a lot of emails from people saying like, oh my gosh, like I'm not going to leave the field now. Or, this gives me faith. Like, this is great. So that's really more what I get. When I do get people, and then the people who like hate me don't message me. Cause I think for the most part, the people who hate me are probably people who have been in the field longer than me. And so they don't think like I'm worth their time, I suspect is what it is.
Sure.
But I think the biggest barrier people have though, is the concerns is not knowing what the trauma history is. And then is people who are concerned about high levels of behavior. And my answer to the second one is like, this only works to a certain point, right? Like if you have a kid who is actively psychotic, right? Or who like actively is engaged dangerous behaviors where you have to have mobile crisis involved or the police involved, like it doesn't matter. Like you can't just like eat carrots in a funny way, right? To de-escalate a behavior.
Right.
And you have to be working with a mental health provider.
Yeah.
Like this isn't like magic, right? Now, when those kids and young adults have their medication under control and they have those supports, then these strategies work. And the teenagers, they have to agree to engage too, right? And so if a teenager is like, I'm not going to do this and I'm going to stay out all night, I'm going to run away. Like, you can put up posters around your house and they're not going to hurt. And maybe they'll get in eventually, but like, it's not going to solve, 15 years of institutionalized trauma from the foster care system. And so I think there's some give and take there. And I don't have the data on what severity this stops, being supportive for.
Yeah.
We do refer out at a certain point.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's just good practice. Is like, if you can't ever claim to have everything be within your scope of practice and competency, at some point there's going to be like, you need to ask for assistance. But that actually leads me really nicely into my next question, which was just what research has currently been done on this, or are we just in a place where it really hasn't been researched sufficiently?
So there hasn't been a lot. We just had a piece, not me, but the field just had a piece come out early this year, which I think will be a seminal piece, which is super exciting. Oh my gosh, I don't have the name of it right now, but there were several authors. Dr. Hanley was one of them. And it basically, sort of looked at all the research that kind of exists, which is not that much.
Yeah.
And sort of talked about sort of the state of trauma-informed ABA.
Okay.
The reasons that behavior analysts argue against it, where the barriers are of introducing it in our field, and how we can overcome those. And it's super exciting. It's really the first time we've had something like that published. And so, all this stuff that I have, like, and I have a handbook, and, everything in the handbook is research-based, but it's not our field. There's like a whole section on like, ways you can help with regulation, like the deep breathing and like grounding and all that stuff. And there's all tons of evidence and research done in like the CBT community. And like, there's studies on like your physical body and what happens when you, count your toes and do those things. But we aren't doing that research.
Yeah. So there's an open call for people to start doing some like solid research on this, where we're looking at using the repeated measures that we would use in traditional behavior analysis sort of research, as well as the observable behaviors that we're interested in looking at, and really, I think, illustrating, as you said, what are the parameters under which we're expected to see this work and work well.
Yeah. And I would love to partner with anybody. I'm talking with a couple of people about looking at caregiver training on this model. I'm also really interested in looking at whether or not the trainings that I'm doing are transferring over into practice.
Yeah, very important.
And whether or not people are able, if they're able to implement them using, the models, because I think they're super effective.
Yeah.
And just seeing what they look like cross practices.
I imagine you've already looked into this, but my partner does a lot of work with PBIS. And when she does workshops and things, it sounds like a lot of the things I've heard described in what they do overlap with some of the things you've described. Because, of course, there's a big emphasis on antecedents, and setting clear expectations is a big one that gets talked about. And they also then provide some like follow-up consultation and support for the caregivers. And these are not professionals. See, most of them are people who they're just parents, they're normal adults doing adult things, but they have no history in psychology or behavior analysis or working with individuals with special needs of any kind outside of just having them around in their house. Either they're their kids or they were adopted or something. So yeah, I imagine that PBIS has some overlap with this.
Actually, probably a good resource to reach out to. It's also really important that you have good people doing consultation with parents. When my youngest had in-home consultation from a BCBA when she first came to us. And this BCBA was like, I need you to take data. Okay. And so I had a 4-year-old and a 5-year-old and a 2-year-old. And we had just had a 1-year-old and 4-year-old like show up at our house.
Whoa.
And I was like, okay, I'm a behavior analyst. I'm going to take my data. I'm going to be so good at it.
Yeah.
And I like had my clipboard and I wish everybody could see me, but I had my 3 adopted girls are all Black and I'm white. And I had my hands in the 1-year-old's hair, like doing her hairstyle and like detangling it. I had my leg up on the dining room table, blocking the 4-year-old and the 2-year-old from like attacking each other. And then I had my 5-year-old crying because I hadn't fed her lunch. And I was supposed to be taking data over the children fighting over my leg.
Yeah.
And so I see the BCBA the next day. I was like, I couldn't take data. Like it was just impossible. And she goes, well, I had 4 kids and I took data. And I was like, what?
Rude.
Yeah. And I was like, I mean, you seem kind of young. I'm surprised you have 4 kids. And she's like, oh, well, they were my stepkids and they were like 11 and like the youngest was 11, the oldest was like 16. And I did it for a school project. And I was just like, and you can't see my face, but it's really angry. And I just walked away.
Listeners, Saundra made a frustrated face.
And I just walked away and I was like, I can never talk to this woman again. I don't know what her name is. I don't know anything about this poor lady. Maybe she like went home and felt like so awful and tells this story as her growth story.
Sure.
But yeah, I like never saw her again. And it's deep in my soul still as like my saltiest moment as a parent.
Yeah, that's I think that's pretty reasonable.
But it made me a better therapist because now I know never ever to compare what I'm capable of doing as a parent to a family.
Yeah, you just don't know what their situation is. You know, there might be other families with the same like age and number of kids who are all just perfectly fine they just go along their day as if they were on Quaaludes and everyone's happy and no problems going on. But you just never know. So I think that's very reasonable. Well, I know we're coming up on our time here. I'd like to just ask you a couple of finishing questions in terms of, it seems like, as you said, we're starting to really see a sort of shift in the field and probably just broadly, even outside of the field, toward more attention to the issue of trauma and trauma-informed care. What else would you like to see happen in the future?
Well, I want our field to be listening to autistic people and autistic criticisms of the field. Yeah. It's complicated because there are a lot of autistic people who think that ABA cannot be fixed at all, no matter what. There are many autistic people who are working in collaboration with BCBAs, and there are autistic BCBAs. Yeah. But I think I spend a lot of time following autistic advocates who think that ABA cannot be reformed and trying to pull things from what they say to help transform what we do. But also it feels complicated because I don't feel like I can be like, well, this person says this, so let's do better. Because I feel like they would feel very angry at me for using their name to advocate like for ABA. So it's this weird spot to be in.
Sure.
But I believe in our science. I believe we have the skill set to teach these skills and do them really well.
Yeah.
As a field, we have to be listening to these people who are talking, and we have to stop saying, but that's not what I do. I mean, even just a couple of weeks ago, I was reviewing a program and realized that it was problematic. So yeah, that's what we have to do as a field before we can like even start comprehensively changing things as a field. Like we still have big names, even in the Facebook groups and giving conferences, like laughing about autistic advocates complaining about things at our national conferences. Yeah. So that has to stop first.
Yeah, I think that's all reasonable. It's a good starting place is just beginning listening and like, letting people know that we're listening and that there's room for change is a great start. I'd love to give you an opportunity. Any final closing thoughts as we wrap up this conversation?
No, this was super fun.
Great.
Yeah, I'm excited that behavior analysts are learning about trauma and excited about trauma. And I'm excited that you wanted me to come talk about it.
Yeah. Thank you for joining us.
All right. Well, that was super fun.
Yeah. Thank you. I appreciate it. Okay. Thank you so much for Saundra Bishop for her time and her expertise in this episode.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I got to see Saundra present at FABA in 2021.
The Florida Association for Behavior Analysis conference.
Yes. Sorry. She did an Ignite session, which are these really interesting. They're like 5-minute talks where the slides themselves self transition.
Yeah, they're automated on timers.
Yeah, and so you have to be really practiced and really well versed in this. And she had one of the best Ignites that I have ever seen, and it was she used the F word, which was awesome.
Wow.
You know, which I'm always like impressed with somebody who can pull that off and pull it off with such swagger and like get people to rally behind her. And she was like had one of the most powerful talks that I've ever seen, and it was called How Kindness Can Change ABA. And I think that she just absolutely exudes and reflects that thought and that theoretical orientation.
Too bad that's not recorded somewhere, but we do have this wonderful recording that you just heard. So we're fortunate to have that for us. Anyway, really enjoyed this interview. So glad we got to talk to her about this. I hope that y'all learned something. If you would like to reach out to us and tell us about your experiences with fostering or adoption, you'd like to talk to us about trauma or any of that sort of thing, then please do. You can always reach out to us and we can pass along your information to Saundra if you'd like to reach out and learn more about what she is doing in her clinic. And if you would like to support the show, you can, of course, leave us a rating and review, subscribe, tell a friend, join us on Patreon. So on Patreon, you get all this cool stuff. You get ad-free episodes, you get early episodes, you get videos of us. I look sweaty after a run. Shane looks handsome after a morning. And he flips his hair. It's great. And you also get discounts on merch and that. And we're working on more perks also coming along. So those are all things that you can get from joining us on Patreon. If you don't got the money to do that sort of thing, though, actually, hold on. If you'd rather walk away with something more tangible, even more tangible than a video and an ad-free episode, you go to our store. You can buy yourself a beanie with a water bottle and a hat and a shirt and a jacket to go over it. And then what you can do is you can walk around like a super fan walking advertisement billboard that we would very much appreciate. And all of that's really good. So you can check out our store for that. If you don't have the money to support us, as I said, just subscribing and telling a friend, reading a review is the way to do that. I think that's pretty much it for that part of it. Am I missing anything there?
One thing I will say is like reviews are like when you're whatever, you know, podcast listening app you use, when you put reviews that are public and let people see that or share, that is really the biggest kind of like support that you can provide. So please consider leaving us a rating and a review because we do appreciate those and we do enjoy those.
Yeah. I mean, be honest, but we also appreciate those super, super positive ones. We're like, greatest show ever.
Yeah. Those always feel good.
Yeah. But you obviously can say whatever you want. We're not going to regulate that. I definitely want to say thank you so much for our team. That is Justin, Shane, Selena, Kyle, and Alan. You're one of those people, Shane.
Oh, thanks. I appreciate that. I like to be a part of that team.
That's right. And of course, thank you for the people who have already joined us on Patreon, who make this possible. And that includes Amanda, Brad, The Daily BA, Joshua, Justin, Justine, Kim, Kostya, Layla, Megan, Mike M, Mike T, and Shauna. What a crew. What a crew of stellar people.
Absolutely.
You know, what I forgot to do is I wanted to ask Saundra before I let her go some recommendations that she could share, and I forgot to, but we still have some recommendations to give.
Recommendations.
I'm actually going to share one from one of our contributing writers, Selena, who helps on the show as well. She had recommended the show The G Word on Netflix, which apparently it covers a lot of government agencies. Is sort of what it sounds really interesting. I have not checked that out, but I'm passing that along for her. For myself, I'm going to recommend a board game like I do.
Yes.
I've been creating a list of recommendations and there's quite a few games on there and they're all kind of thematically similar a little bit. But the one I'm recommending today is called Herbaceous, or if you're in England or you have some kind of English European sort of ancestry, Herbaceous is maybe the way you'd like to go.
Yeah.
It's just a card game. You're basically collecting like sets of different types of herbs. And there's like sage and saffron, rosemary, all kinds of things like that. You're just collecting sets of these cards. And it's a fun, relatively quick, easy to play little game that I think has a decent amount of strategy to it. And it's been really easy for people to like teach to new people who aren't even necessarily big in playing games. So I'm recommending Herbaceous.
Nice. I like that. I'm recommending something that is totally off the rails, but I do hope that you all take some time to do this thing. So it's a movie, and this movie is called Chip 'n Dale Rescue Rangers.
Fun.
I feel like our demographic would appreciate and definitely knows Chip 'n Dale's Rescue Rangers from the 90s, the cartoon, and in the theme song, right? Like whenever I bring that up, everybody hears Chip 'n Dale Rescue Rangers.
That's great.
Those things. So the story is that Chip and Dale have since retired from the show. The show was canceled.
Oh.
And they've retired from the show, and they've had a career afterwards. They've had their own separate careers.
Kind of meta.
And it takes place. It is the most meta because it's literally like they're animated cartoon characters living in the real world. It's very like
Detective Pikachu sort of thing.
Yeah, or like Roger Rabbit. Like it's very like that, where it's like there's cartoons everywhere, and there are human beings, and there's puppets, and there's all these other characters that are like living creatures.
Okay, got it.
In this space. So, the story is that Chip and Dale haven't talked in a long time. Dale has gone off to have a career, and he's like speaking at Comic-Cons, and he gets what he calls is he gets CGI surgery. So he's no longer a 2D animated character. He's 3D, while Chip is still 2D. And that's why you see like the different animation styles and stuff like that. And they cram so much into this. There is cheese addiction. There's like the underground mob. The whole premise is that people are like, these older characters are getting bootlegged, which is horrible. They're being kidnapped and like plastic surgeryed into like these other, it's really, really dark.
Wow.
Excellent watch. It is it is up there as one of like so far one of my favorite things that I've consumed this year.
Wow.
So
this year is already almost halfway over.
It is so much fun. So please go watch it and enjoy it, because you will appreciate it just from the perspective of if you grew up with that, but also just all of the references and all the stuff they cram into it, including Ugly Sonic.
That's so much fun. I really want to check that out now. I think it's on Disney Plus. Is that right?
It's on Disney Plus right now. Yeah.
Okay, got it. All right. I kind of did the closing of this out of order. I usually do all the credits and thank yous after we do recommendations, but we ended on recommendations. So I think that's kind of all we have to say. Do you have anything else?
That's it. I got nothing else.
All right. Then this is Abraham.
And this is Shane.
We're out.
See ya.
You've been listening to Why We Do What We Do. You can learn more about this and other episodes by going to www.wwdpodcast.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope you have an awesome day.